Hello and welcome to the latest installment of our Helix Education webinar series, COVID-19, the Roadmap to Fall 2020. Today we're talking about quality online teaching and learning, specifically tools to engage students in online learning. Thanks everybody so far who has joined us. We're so happy to have you with us today, as well as our special guest, who I'll introduce here in a second. This is the 14th webinar in this series. Holy cow. So if you've been with us before, welcome back. If this is your first time, we're super glad to have you, and just a couple housekeeping items to make you aware of. We are recording today's webinar. We'll be posting it on our Helix Education YouTube channel a little later on today. And so we also have a live transcript service, Otter AI, who is providing a kind of real-time transcript for this. And so there is a link to that transcript in the chat. And so if you'd like to take advantage of that service, it is there. We also welcome your questions throughout the proceedings today. So at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A icon. You can click on that at any time and submit your question. If you see something that you're curious about, go ahead and put it there in that Q&A, and we'll address it as we go through the material today. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our three special guests, all members of Helix Education's Academic Services team. First is Scott Walker, our Director of Academic Technology. Scott is a great person to have on here because he has both instructional experience. He's currently an online instructor in lots of history courses owing to his Ph.D. in history from Arizona State. He also has lots of instructional design, ed tech, LMS conversion, project management, lots of expertise on that side of the fence as well. And so Scott, super glad to have you. Thank you for joining us. This is Scott's first webinar. Our other two guests have been on previous webinars of ours. Emily Wood, our Director of Instructional Design at Helix Education. So again, like Scott, has experience both as an instructor as well as lots of experience in the instructional design field. And so 12 years total experience in higher education, the last 5 of those with Helix Education. And Emily, how close are you to getting that EDD at Northeastern? It feels like it's going to be
getting closer.
Right.
Finishing chapters 1 and 2.
All right. Awesome. So thanks, Emily. And then lastly, our most prolific webinar presenter in this go around. We were talking beforehand that of the 14 webinars we've done so far, Cherron, our Vice President and Chief Academic Officer, has been in 9 of them, 9 times. And so, but we're super happy to have Cherron on these because of her 3 decades in higher education, student affairs, enrollment management, academic administration, accreditation peer reviewer, former dean of undergraduate programs, doctorate degree in education. Such a wealth of experience in all of our pillars of a transition to quality online learning, or particularly when it comes to online teaching and learning, a wealth of experience to draw from. And so those are our presenters. And so I'm going to turn the time over to Cherron to get us started on this tools to engage students in online learning topic. So Cherron, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sparky. You always make me feel so good about myself when you do those introductions. It's my pleasure to be with you all again today. You know, every once in a while you get a magic team that you get to work with. And I have to say, my work with Scott and Emily around instructional design and how Helix has been trying to advance some best practices for that with our partners has just been such a delight. I learn from the 2 of them every day. So I'm thrilled to be here today as a moderator for a conversation that we want to have with you all. And really our goals for today we want to touch base on some of the pedagogical techniques to think about how to really engage students in a blended and online modality. We want to just get creative with you on some tips and ideas. And we hope that you'll jump in with your ideas and your suggestions as well. I think all of us find that the best work comes from people who are passionate about online education, really wanting to think about how to break that paradigm and how to bring a really thoughtful, intentional experience to our students. So we hope that you'll jump in with us as we also explore some best practices around using technologies in the learning management system for online learning education. For those of you who have been with us for a while, as Sparky said, we've been doing this since May, really wanting to share with institutions our years of experience and knowledge and resources as everyone tries to prepare for what is coming almost tomorrow, right? The start of the fall 2020 term, in times that just really I never expected to see in my career in higher ed. And so we've been moving through our 4 pillars week by week. And we hope that if you haven't been able to join us, that you'll also check out our website. Sparky will share that information at the end of our session today. But you'll see all of our recordings, some additional podcasts, lots of resources that are available for you as we've gone on this journey together over the course of the summer. And we all know what we're living in, unprecedented circumstances. I'm hoping there's a point where we can get past this. But for now, I think every day is still a new adventure. And you can see here as we start to think about what institutions have been announcing daily. This is actually from the Chronicle of Higher Education has been collecting as institutions announce what their plans are and what they intend to do. So this particular graph we pulled up just this morning, but look at how much things can change in a very short period of time. When we first started this and tapped into this data on June 2nd, 66% of institutions reporting or planning on being fully in person. Just a week ago, that number was at 49%. And as of this morning, we're down to about 21% reporting. I think lots of institutions still trying to figure out what the best options are to capture a college experience, to keep faculty and staff and students safe, and to keep their doors open, because there are financial implications for all of this as well. So this is definitely been a challenging time for the entire higher ed sector. You know, this is a great graph, Phil on EdTech. If you all don't follow his blog, I highly recommend it. There's some great stuff in there. But early on, he talked about kind of what we're looking at in terms of where we are in transitioning through this. And, you know, all of a sudden we kind of woke up and some places had 2 days, some places were lucky to have 2 weeks, but everything needed to move online. And so this was immediate. What is our stopgap? What do we go to knowing that we can't be in person right now? And much of that was around web conferencing, Teams, Google Hangout, Zoom, whatever that might have been. But then as we moved into the summer, I think the reality of it is that many times we made assumptions about the circumstances of our students and even our faculty in some cases, that they had the hardware that they needed, that they had internet access that would be stable enough to support the work that they needed to do from home. And many times that wasn't the case. And I think particularly for those of you who might be in connected to K through 12 communities, I have a dear friend of mine that works in one of the largest districts in Colorado Springs. They ended up pulling school buses that were hotspots into critical neighborhoods that they knew didn't have internet, just so their kids could continue learning. So it was kind of a wake-up call for everybody to think about the digital divide is alive and well in 2020. And so now as we're stepping into decisions for the fall, I think all of us understand that it can't be that emergency anymore. We really need to start moving to thoughtful and intentional and planful as much as we can with everything as crazy as it is, which then, you know, really begs the question, does this change the shape of how we think about not only higher education, but the role of online teaching and learning in the scope of all of this? And early on, I would have conversations with colleagues, and one of their questions was, well, when we're past this, we don't need to worry about the difference between remote emergency teaching and really high quality online learning. And I would say, one, we're learning very quickly that COVID is with us for a while and probably will be for a while longer. So there's definitely that need to pay attention to the quality online learning part of things as we move into this last quarter of the year, the last half of the year. But I think the other reality of it is that this is going to really become a necessity from a crisis contingency planning perspective. If you were with us last week, one of our colleagues from Brunel University shared the fact that they were actually fairly prepared for this, as much as you could be, but they had also faced a couple of hurricane seasons that put them on watch for their campus, and they had to quickly shut down operations and quickly come up with some alternatives as a result of that. And so that experience had put them in a much better place than I think institutions that haven't had to deal with, you know, Mother Nature doing her fun stuff. And now we all really need to be thinking about What role can online technology, can our learning platforms, can our strategies with our faculty play for that long-term contingency planning? The other side of what I think we're all realizing is that the world is not sustainable spent on a web conference. Thank you very much for joining us at this one, but we all get zoomed out, and it can be a bit much. And I think particularly when we're thinking about this being the only way to get information to our students, that can create a bit of a challenge. And I think particularly as we think about students across the time zones, students who might not have a private, quiet place that they can fully engage in the online environment, not having the right technologies, whatever that might be. And so really thinking about moving beyond the short-term synchronous decisions that were made coming out of the spring, and really thinking about there is a time and a place for synchronous. It has real value, and we're going to talk about some of those ideas in just a minute. But really thinking about how do we marry the best of all of those worlds for a really outstanding student experience. So we just want to jump into a conversation. We've had some questions that were submitted previously. We've had some conversations about things that we want to be sure that we can talk about with you all. But we also hope that you will jump in and either use the chat or the Q&A feature. Sparky's going to help us kind of track those and be a part of the conversation with us. So I'm going to stop my screen share here. And want to open up just a little bit by first talking about what this conversation will be and what it won't be. And I know there were a couple of folks that asked questions, specifically, would we show various tools or, beyond just the superficial of a demo of something like that? And that's really not our purpose here. We want to talk about kind of the ways to integrate things into your teaching and learning and think about it, but we're going to leave the demonstration of the tools to the folks that do it best, and that's the folks that have created those tools. But certainly if you've got questions about ideas and about ways things could be integrated, we've all had different experiences with some of these tools, so we can certainly talk about how we've used them and what we want to do. I think the other thing that's a grounding for the conversation that you're going to hear today and that we want you to be a part of is that we, at the end of the day, feel like instructor presence wins the game. Doesn't matter how fancy your tools are or how well edited your videos are. If you can demonstrate to your students that you are present in the moment, that your exchanges with them have value and meaning, whether it's in a discussion question or it's in the feedback that you're giving them, or if it's how you might, jump into a small group and have a conversation, whatever that is, your presence is going to beat everything else that can be offered. And we really come to this from a position of thinking about this as a community of inquiry. We want to be focused on student-to-student engagement, faculty-to-student engagement, and student-to-content engagement, and making sure that the tools that we talk with you about and the strategies that we share allow that to happen. So thank you again, and we're going to jump on in. Scott, here's a good one for you as our head tech guru around this stuff. Yeah. When you think about conversations you have with faculty as a designer, or even in your own, the way you think about building a course, just as a general approach, what are some of kind of top of mind considerations that you want folks to have as they're thinking about what technology to bring into their learning environments?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, honestly, the segue that you did, talking about the idea that it's really more about engagement, it's more about structure, it's more about outcomes than it is really about trying to get the slickest new tech tool, is really probably the best segue I could think of. What I see often as somebody that straddles both the world of sort of instructional design and academic technology, and I've been doing it now for 14 years in this business, is some common mistakes. One of them, this doesn't apply to every faculty, but it's one that I see quite a bit. It can be very attractive to try and be the avant-garde person that's coming up with the new flashy technology that's out there, try and implement it in your class, and try to encourage going outside systems that you usually would use, trying new realms, in the interest of trying to make your course look better, and hopefully there is many slick features that can be done in outside systems. What I constantly try to warn people that I work with is really to try to level set that with what you're going to achieve by going outside that system, and then the risks that are going to be involved once you do that. So one of the most common things that I'll see is they'll try to take their students outside of the system. I would first say the LMS, your learning management system, whether it's Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, or any one that you use, is going to be really your best place to start. And the reason why is that, honestly, even though it doesn't keep up with every ed tech piece of platform there is, obviously it's going to be a little bit behind. For the most part, 95% of what you want to do is going to be able to get accomplished within that system and the native features you have. And there's lots of benefits to that as well. So the benefit of staying within your system is that it's going to be a well-supported system. And that's really number one in my mind, right? So if you're sending them off to another system, all of a sudden that now becomes your responsibility, whether you're a faculty member, whether you're a student services rep, or anybody that's responsible for doing that. You say, try out this new system, you're going to love it. They can't log in right, they don't know how to use it. Now all of a sudden you send them to a system that you don't understand, and you're getting emails all day trying to get them to use it. So on something like that, maybe it could have been just as nice really too, and maybe you would have achieved everything that they needed to put them into groups within your LMS. Each LMS has got pretty high-end group features, and they're getting better all the time. So a system like Canvas, for example, I'm trying to not throw out too many names, but every once in a while I will, and they're all getting there. Has an area where you go into collaborations, you can get access to chats, you can launch a web conferencing system, you could do many different things, and that's all within that system. So now those students are using a system that they completely understand. There's a good chance they've already used those tools before. You're keeping them within that course environment, so you're not trying to get them to authenticate elsewhere. And you have a lot better possibility that if they do have problems, you're going to leave it on your institution's help desk support to help you out with that. And I've seen that become problematic for a lot of faculty that are trying to say, hey, this thing's cool, I wanted to try it.
Yeah.
Think about those outcomes that you want to achieve. Think about what you want to get out of it and whether it's really worth those risks and that extra navigation to get them over there. That being said, plenty of times I've seen it where there is some stuff that might be worth it to send them outside that system, right? And that's, like I said, the LMS doesn't necessarily keep up with every ed tech piece of technology almost by definition. It's going to lag behind just slightly. And if the tools really do seem to be worth it, if you are seeing functionality that you believe students are going to gain from, I would say just trying to get them to one piece of technology, number one, and then if you can, make it an integrated piece of technology. And by that I mean there's tons of LTI integrations out there, and that's learning tool interoperability. Said that one right. I know the transcript service is going to have a tough time with that one now. But the idea is that you can look through and you can find a lot of stuff that can incorporate in there. Always look to your university and see what they have that maybe you didn't know about. That they said, hey, we have this great integrated piece of software. The benefit of that is once they actually use that software, it does operate almost like a native feature if it's a decent integration. You're going to be able to deploy it within the class. It's not going to go to outside systems, and it's going to be a much more seamless sort of centralized experience in that regard. So instructionally, definitely try to keep them as streamlined within the systems that you have. Utilize all the university technologies that you have, preferably integrated within your system. And I don't know if I've mentioned it, but if you want to look around at other systems, there is a system called Edu App Center, and I think it's just eduappcenter.com. It is actually created by Instructional, which is the owner of the company of Canvas, but it's good for any system because the LTI language operates with any sort of LMS platform that's complying with that system. So you can take a look at what's available over there and make sure if you find a good system, see if it can integrate. Even if you don't have an integration, you might be able to ping somebody and find out. So I think those are a couple of my key pieces. My final piece that I would like to say too, I know that we come from different perspectives on this group, and sometimes institutionally I'll see, especially for example, when COVID-19 first hit, we had this immediate and drastic need to give people access to as many tools as possible. And this can happen in a classroom setting as well, not just from an administrative perspective. And I saw a lot of people saying, hey, here's all the resources you have. Here's 19 different video communications tools that you could use. I would caution that because now they don't know which ones to go to. It's probably more confusing. And what are the possibilities that you actually know how to support all those systems, that you can navigate those systems well. Try to keep it to the best system that you identified for the purposes of your faculty in general. Encourage them to go that one. And then if there's questions, if there's emergency, there's a much better chance, even if it is outside technology, that you're going to be able to support that system.
So in a nutshell, essentially less is more when it comes to
more,
this stuff.
exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Don't try to do the smoke and mirrors and all that. And early adopting is great and I love it, but there's a benefit at the end of the day, I do believe, to waiting and seeing which ones are the winners and the losers, because there's also a lot of vaporware out there too. It's kind of nice to let it sit and settle before you really make your choice.
So Emily, what about from your perspective, from a design viewpoint, what comes to top of mind for you as you're having these conversations with folks?
Oh, sure. So in terms of tools, I think taking it from a different perspective of what Scott shared is, as you ask folks to go out, your students to go out to different systems, there's also the concern about, are those systems as accessible? And what is the student privacy data pieces there that could be a concern? And so accessibility is really a large part of what we think about when we recommend tools for specific tasks. And really what we want to do is have the tools that are being used to engage students really support the course outcomes. And so you'll hear me say this several times in the webinar. It's all about going back to the course outcomes and to thinking through, what am I trying to accomplish and how can I best do that? And is it through a technical solution, or is it through maybe reorganizing an assignment or reconsidering how I group students? Could be a possible way to think through a less technical solution, but one that still utilizes the tools that you have available.
Emily, one of the questions, and this is certainly a design kind of conversation, we often hear about the role of an instructional designer as it relates to online or maybe even blended learning, but design can be helpful all the way across the board, which makes me think about this question. It says, in a world where I will most likely need to pivot from one modality to the next, how can I best prepare for the upcoming term? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, just given the times we are living in right now, I think that's very likely a possibility. As folks have been preparing for classes, and then suddenly there's been changes in terms of some of the plans colleges have been putting out. There likely is a point where if you were planning for in-class instruction, it might have to go online. That might have to happen before the term was set to start or midway through the term. And so it gets to be not only instructional planning, but also some contingency planning going on as well. Really what we recommend is to think through your course in terms of an online course design first. There's several different reasons for doing this, but by thinking through an online course design and what it would look like completely built out in LMS for an asynchronous student experience where students are not together with you at the same time, it asks you to think about and externalize your instructional goals and your instructional methods in a way that you don't always see in the classroom when you might be introducing something, and you can fill in some of those gaps. So if you plan for building online, it's a lot easier to back that out if you do get the opportunity to have synchronous sessions, whether those are held virtually, such as via Zoom or another web conferencing tool, or in a specific place and location.
Awesome, thank you. And I was just noticing, Diane asked a question about what we feel like the conferencing tool is the best when it comes to accessibility. I have my thoughts on it. You want to jump in, Emily?
Yeah, I think part of it is I would really check out what your school is recommending, what your institution is recommending, because chances are the technical folks at your school have done some of the vetting to make sure that it meets the accessibility standards. There is quite a bit of accessibility challenges that can come up with our standard web conferencing tools such as WebEx or Zoom, because those really were not designed to provide an accessible experience to learners. They were designed for a business purpose. And so we as educators are using them in a way that wasn't quite how they were designed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, from our own example, Zoom is probably one of the few that has the live text integration through the third party Otter AI that we brought into this, which is really nice to have. But the reality of it is those automatic systems for voice translating as a live stream just are not particularly accurate. Our editor can tell you as she goes in and cleans up transcripts or even if you've tried to do this with YouTube, right? It gets you maybe 70% of the way there, but you'll also want to think about for the longevity of whatever it is you're using, that it really be edited and cleaned up before you publish either a webinar like this or something else. From an accessibility perspective, the actual recommended is that you have a live translator, someone doing ASL in the moment, providing that transcription, or more of a human doing the typing as you go along. That shouldn't be me. I'm not that good of a typist. Scott, do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I think you hit on that perfectly. I think I think it's going to improve over the next few years now that we're seeing this whole new dimension and this whole new realm. But right now we are really working behind the times when it comes to the system. So the plugin systems are going to be the best way to go as far as synchronous platforms. I will say closed captioning is getting better in some systems. It's okay in Microsoft Teams. This one has a little bit of work, and our editor definitely has a lot of fun seeing the mistakes that could happen, which is why it's a little bit, scary to kind of put it out right away, because you don't know how it's going to translate it. But you look at one like YouTube, I think is now turned fantastic. Obviously, they're one of the more mature people when it comes to that, and I think we're going to see that start to follow suit real soon. For right now, it's a great question, and it's a challenge that we more or less have to address as best we can as we can.
And I'm going to share a link, and we'll of course have links in our materials that we'll show later, but I ran across this last week, and it is from cast.org, which is a really wonderful site, organization very concerned with accessibility, particularly in education situations. And they don't recommend a specific product, but they do have a list of considerations for folks who are looking at web conferencing, not only to select a tool, but also how to best utilize the features. So I'm going to share that now, because Diane, this is just a wonderful question.
That's awesome. And we'll add it. We added a slide within this deck that has some of the resources, and we'll be sure to add this one to it as well. So when we share out the deck, you can have access to all of these links as well. So when we think about kind of creating interest and attention, I mean, we've all been there in the meeting. I saw a meme yesterday on Facebook that was like, the most used phrase in 2020 is, no, you're on mute. No, you're on mute, right? We've all kind of had our moments of zooming out through these times. And so how do we really create attention and interest in students that are much more experienced being face-to-face students than they would be online students? And Scott, tell us some of your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'll kick it off a little bit here, and then give some general thoughts, and I think we can probably go back and forth a bit. But really, again, it's going back, starting with the theoretical part of this. I have seen, again, as my role as a sort of academic technologist and instructional designer, instructors come to me consistently and say, hey, this is what I did in my face-to-face class. Tell me how to do this almost exactly the best way you can in this class. I did 45 minutes of lecture here. Let's do 45 minutes of camera on this one. I did a 5-minute breakout. Let's do that. And to that, I got to say, and I know this will be a little bit repetitive, but I almost don't think we can say it enough. Go back to those course outcomes, go back to those unit or module outcomes, whatever you call them, and think about those first and foremost. What are you trying to achieve within your course? And then if you take a step back from that point and say, all right, given these desired outcomes I want to get, what's going to be the best way that we could actually make those happen with the tools that we have? And again, that goes first and foremost to the LMS, but it's nice to know other pieces of platforms and say, is this going to be the best? Sometimes a simple discussion really goes a long way, just to reiterate that stuff. And what they achieve before, they have no idea once they actually go to the online environment, how effective a well thought out, engaging, participative discussion can be. So that's my thoughts to kind of kick that one off in general. I don't know if you have any specifics on that one, Emily, or any ideas.
Yeah, I think part of it is to really think through, yes, I don't want to replicate an online or an in-person experience online, but thinking through how can I really use this as an opportunity to think creatively about how do I give my students that same learning experience where they're going to, or reaching those same learning goals through different experiences. I know when we first went online, one of our institutions that we were partnering with, was asking, how do we create an online experience that mimics our costume design lab that we had going on campus, and thinking through, well, maybe we could send out samples of fabrics to students, and maybe instead of having them display and create their product and display it through a fashion show as we typically do, can we think about that in a virtual manner? Or could they create a vision board to illustrate what they would choose for a costume design? So still meeting those same learning outcomes, but thinking about it in a little bit of a different route that helped allow for the flexibility that everybody needed and the grace everybody needed in spring semester.
Well, I think probably one of the most fun projects I did was for another one of our partners. It was in a business law class. And that professor wanted there to be an opportunity for a negotiation, and really kind of experience what that process is as you're going through negotiation around the legal contract and what that might look like. And one of the things that she did that I thought was so fun is that as she broke the students out into small groups, she gave secret information to various players on the teams. So I might know an outcome of the negotiation, but somebody else is going to know what my weak spot is. Like, where am I most vulnerable in terms of what I can give up or not? And so everybody kind of came to the table with this secret information and then had to, in a discussion area, go through the negotiation process. And it was spelled out what needed to happen kind of at each stage and what points needed to be hammered out. And then ultimately, who won in that negotiation and why? What was the rationalization behind it? And then once all of that transpired, then the secrets came out. And it was a really great opportunity for students to have that experiential moment of working through that. It also gave them space because this happened over the course of a couple of weeks. And so as they were writing their answers and really kind of processing, here's what I know theoretically about negotiation, here's how I bring it to this practice, it advanced their learning in that process. And I was thrilled at the way that it came together, both as a scaffolded assignment, but also as one that was staged throughout a period of the term, and thought, boy, this could be used in a debate structure. Right? We often think, what are we missing in that person-to-person exchange in the classroom? And there are truly ways to replicate it. And in her case, she allowed students to write. They could use voice, like a voice thread, or even video to make their case and post it to that discussion board. And now the LMS systems really support that quite easily. So it was a cool assignment. So, if you've got ideas for those of you that are listening in, really creative stuff or challenges that you want to throw out at us to see if we can kind of pick it apart, that's one of our favorite things to do. But in the meantime, we'll go on and Emily, I'm going to ask you this. This was another question sent in. Synchronous versus asynchronous. How do you know which will work best for which part of your course?
Yeah, and some of this is defined by circumstances, but as you're thinking through, hey, maybe I have the opportunity to meet in person and part of it's going to be virtual, which is a model that we're seeing quite frequently, more universities are moving towards. Really asking yourself, what are you trying to accomplish and what are the goals there? If you're going to have some sort of time-bound or place-bound activity, a synchronous, we're all going to be in the same place, whether that's virtual or whether that's physical, it really needs to be specific. It needs to be special. There needs to be a reason why we're coming together, and it needs to be very structured. So that usually means it needs to be more than just a lecture, and it needs to be very purposeful. So, and I just challenge faculty that I work with, if you look at your course outcomes and you ask yourself, if you only had 3 hours to be in the same space at the same time with these students, how would you best use that time for them as learners and for yourself as a teacher? And chances are it's not going to be exams or reviewing the syllabus or a lecture. And I know that's an artificial constraint to think just of 3 hours, but that really helps you to prioritize, this is what my course is. And if everything else was virtual, this is the one thing that I really need to have when we're active and engaged in the same space together. And then you can go from there and build around that. And I think that really just having a good purpose for what tools you're using when you're getting folks together in the synchronous spaces, and being really clear about what the expectations are, not only before the course begins and as students are entering your course and know what those expectations are as far as we can know at the start of the term, but know why you've chosen that tool or why you've chosen that particular point in the semester to come back together, so they can prepare for that and they can really understand part of your instructional goals as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Boy, we spend a lot of time focused on context. Why are we picking that resource? Why do these things connect together? How do they connect together? Because I think for the learner, as we want them to be able to synthesize and really process through to understand the broader picture of what we want them to learn in the classroom, that context is so critical. But you're right. The context is just as important about the how and the when as it is for the what in terms of the learning that we want them to do. Scott, do you have some thoughts on when you are doing those synchronous sessions, what would you say would be some best practice ideas for that?
Yeah, definitely. I think what you keep on hearing nowadays, especially in this time frame, is people all of a sudden getting Zoom burnout. I know for us, we've been using Zoom forever, all day, so we've had it before and we thought a lot about it. And so we try and change it up for a little bit. There are certain ways that you could do it. One of the ways that I try and think of is stay away as many times as you can. We have this Brady Bunch screen, if you want to call it that, for a very short period of time, which is great. But we've also gone slide decks. Anytime that you can mix it up and use the different modalities that a lot of people just seem to either don't know about. Some of them need enabling within the system, but whether you're talking about Zoom or Big Blue Button or any of those, you're usually going to have a lot of different features within it. The first one is going to be the most basic. What we're using right now is chat, right? And chat can be, if it was just me running this and I was doing it on my own, I would have a difficult time trying to talk to you all and then still read down the chat and look at that through and still process and actively listen to the people that are around in it. So try and use the tools and the people that you have around that could help. If you have a TA, that'd be number one. See if your TA can kind of listen, help moderate. Anytime that you could bring that into sort of a community forum, again, that interactivity in that is going to be great. You can jump around from that. You can do a little bit of screen sharing to get off that mode and see some different stuff. A lot of the systems have whiteboard if that's going to be effective for the kind of content that you want to teach as well. I generally try and think about in the same rule of thumb that I think about almost any sort of content instructional medium. If you are going to go on here and talk for 45 minutes, if you're going to try and pull off a lecture, I don't want really people doing that necessarily in the classroom, and I don't want them doing it in video or podcast or anything. It's got to be something, if you want to keep people engaged, to move around on. And I think at this point, kind of in this, we're still very, very new, I understand, in sort of our pedagogical approach to how we're using it, because it was more or less forced on a lot of people in ways that they couldn't imagine. But I would love to see people start to get a little bit more creative when we do have that strategic need to get everybody online, whenever it is. But don't just do it just because you say, hey, I love to talk about, I'm a historian. I love to talk about World War II and the aftermath. So I want to talk and get everybody online because I'm really, really interested about that. Think more about, again, outcomes that you want to achieve and when it's going to be a great point to try and get people on in that system. You can also do some interesting stuff as well with the students too. So different ways to keep them engaged. Again, encouraging participation in the chat window. Some don't want to speak up on audio, and sometimes in a bigger class you don't really want them to, right? It becomes too much to try and navigate audio, but having them use that and then having them work together perhaps in collaborative note-taking documents. Anytime that you get students, in my mind, working with themselves, they're establishing a little bit of community, but if they go to Google and they have a shared note drive, now they're thinking together, they're kind of building on each other's thoughts, they're adding stuff they didn't think about. Hopefully afterwards too, they'll make some time and they'll all work together to sort of process the note-taking together from that session. Interesting things that you could do, and perhaps they might even be doing breakout groups within the Zoom or within the web conferencing feature itself, and say you guys work together and come up with a think, pair, share exercise where you guys are collaborating ideas. Now I'm going to ask you, and we're going to bring everybody back. But again, try to stay away from just that monolithic time of pure one-directional conversation and staying in one sort of stagnant screen is one of my best recommendations.
So speaking of tracking chat, while we're doing all this, I've been peeking in on stuff. So Marcy asked a really great note, and she asked, from a program perspective, what suggestions do you have for building community in our asynchronous program? And I don't mind jumping in on that. As a dean, I had probably 85% of my students who lived within easy commute distance to campus, except I was in San Francisco and nothing is easy. And so the vast majority of my students were online. And we did a couple of things, and we really thought about it in multidimensional. One is that even with adult students, I know Marcy has graduate students primarily, have fun. It's okay to do that with these students. They actually probably appreciate lightening that up. So one of the things that we did was take our institution mascot, and for those of you who might be familiar with the kids' story, Flat Stanley, well, we had a flat griffin, and everybody got a griffin, and we had folks take the griffin on vacation or to school with the kids or whatever it might be doing, to the office. And it was a great way. We had a closed Facebook community at the time, and folks shared those stories and those pictures, and they got to know one another. Another great way to do it is to think about how you can spotlight students for a variety of reasons. Some of it might be academic achievement, some of it might be professional achievement, but to get them a chance to know one another on a level outside of just being classmates. And so we did a student spotlight every month, and had the opportunity for folks to tell their stories. And in doing that, it was incredibly motivational. And students really got excited for one another and for the chance to tell their own story. I think the other thing is to think of how you might create some mentoring communities. So as you begin to explore interests of your students or career changers, if you can match folks up kind of cross-company or cross-functional within work so they can support and mentor one another through the learning, I think that's another really great way to begin to build that community, even if everything that you're doing is asynchronous. And I think particularly for many programs, because they students are going to pace themselves pretty consistently, you'll find that they'll kind of create their own cohorts, even if your structure is in a very specific lockstep kind of cohort model. And I had one bunch that literally specifically would make a single appointment with an advisor so they could all make sure they were in the same classes together. So there's some cool things that you can do with that. Do you guys have any thoughts you want to add about kind of the outside of classroom community and what some ideas might be?
You covered a lot of it from my end. Those are some brilliant ideas, and great to have that experience from your practice.
And just real quick to piggyback on it from my end, this isn't necessarily an outside the community thing, but inside the community, inside the classroom, things can spur outside the community things, of course. So I love just group projects. I always try and put them in. And sure, that could be a very transactional thing. It could be something where I've seen it plenty of times. They build up very good for kinships, and they work together. I love the idea of using social networking outside of it. There's other systems that you could use that are more specific to, and like a system like Yammer, which is more something you could download that could be more specific towards your community. But anything that you could do to kind of start that conversation in the classroom and get them to be invested and interactive with each other, I think the greater chance that you're going to have that they're going to work outside together on their own without even any prodding or anything.
So David asked a tough question. I know, Emily, you and I spent some time noodling through some of this with partners at the start of all of this. He says, do you have any recommendations for programs that require hands-on labs, such as nursing, physical therapy, welding, cosmetology, et cetera, to replace those labs in an online environment and ensure competencies are covered and the assessment is of equal rigor to that of an on-site hands-on lab? So we did some specific research around nursing, David, and I'm happy to share what we found looking at a couple of lab settings. I think where in any of those where the biggest challenges are getting the specialized accreditors or the licensing bodies to open up their understanding of what this lab work means. And let's be real. I'm not interested in a nurse putting an IV on me that has only done it in a simulation. I'd like them to actually practice with supervision. So I don't know that we'll ever get away from that. But I do think that there are some ways to balance out what needs to happen in a clinical with what needs to happen or what can happen online. The challenge is that the technology is just catching up. I'm doing some research now for another partner who wants to think about cosmetology in a more blended environment. Their licensing is very specific in the number of hands-on clinical hours that has to happen, but how could we get creative with the rest of the instruction? And it all goes back to what those boards are saying and what allowance they'll give. But like I said, I'm certainly happy to share with you some of the work that Emily and I did early on around a couple of different options for nursing, which seems to be, in my estimation, ahead of many of those other disciplines.
Yeah, nursing and dental hygiene. I've been keeping in touch with some of my community college contacts, and really they've said that there's been some good guidance given by their accrediting bodies on what does constitute an acceptable alternative, when those alternatives would be in place, and if they have to sit for an exam, what that looks like and what counts towards that, those credits. So that's a good first place to start, and to see what community might have formed around those professional organizations as folks are in the same place as you, thinking through those alternative means, and the assessment of those.
Yeah. So a friend and colleague from California, Mark, sent us a note, and he says, several years ago, there was an online pedagogical planner, Phoebe, that linked learning outcomes to technology approaches. Do you know of a similar resource today? And that's not one that I'm familiar with.
No, I would love to have a tool like that.
I know.
So they linked one more time again, Cherron, just make sure I understand the question.
It was an online pedagogical planner called Phoebe that linked learning outcomes to technology approaches. So Mark, you've stumped us on that one, but I bet you I know what some people are going to be researching this afternoon.
Yeah.
So we'll keep you posted with what we find for sure. Okay, Mark says it was UK based and he's going to send us a link. So we'll definitely look into it and see if there's what the modern version of that might be. So thank you. So we have just a few more minutes left. And Emily, I think this is an important one and one near and dear to your heart, and I don't want to lose sight of this, and that's understanding the learner. As we think about going into online and blended modalities, what can we do to really think about differentiated activities and learner needs as we're taking our approach to design? Yeah,
so a lot of it comes through pre-planning and having an idea of how you might break out assignments or break out the assessments that are done in your course in different ways. And going back to the outcomes and the criteria by which you as the instructor will be able to determine, did the students meet those outcomes? Can they demonstrate that knowledge? Can they demonstrate that skill or ability? And then thinking, well, how can I best determine that? What the criteria, how can I best articulate the criteria so it's not necessarily attached to the format of the current assignment? So if your outcomes are to analyze theories of personality and compare theories of personality, does that have to be done in a 6 to 8 page paper, for instance? So if you can break it away from the format of what you've been asking for the assignment or what your peers have been asking for the assignment, and think about what are some other ways that students can provide alternative means for expression of their knowledge there and for demonstrating their knowledge. And that just goes to UDL principles, but it allows for differentiation where students have autonomy and choice in choosing how they best want to demonstrate those, whether it's a presentation, a podcast, maybe a written piece of work or artifact that doesn't look like the traditional research paper, for instance. And a big way that you as the instructor can make a big impact in terms of instructor presence and also better understand your students at the start of the term is in the first week or as students first start logging into the course, maybe a couple weeks before, is asking them to share a little bit about where they are, what space they're in currently, and what they bring to the classroom in terms of their skills, their strengths, their interest and where they want to grow. It's wonderful to see that happen in introduction discussions or in mini About Me assignments that are done in the first week. And you can get an understanding about why students are in the class, what they hope to achieve, and tailor some of your assignments and your options and potentially even some of your content towards those needs.
Thank you for that. And I think that that's such a critical point. No, that's great. Diane just mentioned she uses an interactive syllabus to get some of that type of information from her students. And there have been some amazing creative approaches to that I've seen recently. And that's really great. Diane, I'd be interested if you just want to type something back to us. Have you been doing that for very long? And how do your students respond to that? Are they engaging in the ways that you hope that they would? And we'll see what Diane writes back for us. But Emily, one other question, that we see and hear a lot of it, and that's this idea of rigor. Isn't online easier? Or how do I make sure that my course is really holding to the standards that I want it to, and that I would expect, or that I think that I'm delivering in the in-person class? What are some thoughts around that?
Yeah, and that almost goes back to David's question about how to make sure that the rigor is equal to what would happen in an in-person class, such as a lab. A big part of that is making sure that you are giving realistic estimations of the time that it will take for a student to complete an activity, and take an inventory of all that you plan students to do in your class, and see, well, how long will that actually take students? And Rice University's Center for Teaching Excellence has a wonderful workload estimator where you can get a sense of how long will this take a student, and how does that get me towards the credit hour requirement that I must fulfill. And that works in terms of thinking about it from an hour perspective. Thinking about it from how do I ensure that I'm meeting these outcomes is really going to be the key question there, and making sure that your assessments are clearly aligned and your criteria are clearly aligned to those.
Great. So this is great. So Diane says she used it for the first time last semester, and she's going to try it again this term in a different course that worked very well this first time. That's a great tip. Thank you, Diane. So we have like a minute and a half left. Scott, what do you hope from the academic technology course build perspective that folks walk away with today?
So I would say that a couple of the main points. Number one, there's a couple even that we haven't hit on too much because we have such a short period of time. But again, hoping that people understand that if you're going to have a good reason, I love the idea of knowing stuff out there. We'll send out the resources for the Edu App Center. Research what's going to be available, and there's some great stuff out there too that could really help out your educational objectives. But again, trying to make sure that you're being very dedicated, very clear, and very thoughtful in the way that you do it. I just think a lot of people can sometimes get out to, hey, more is better. Let's just throw out everything under the sun, and let's try everything we can, and let's put our students wherever we can. If it doesn't have a good, clear benefit over something that you could get either within your course management system as a native tool or one that's going to be an integrated tool, I would stay away from that as much as possible unless you can really see just a clear advantage towards achieving those outcomes that they didn't have before. My final point that I would love to get into at some point, maybe another webinar entirely, but is accessibility. And there's some great new stuff that's coming out.
Yeah.
Accessibility that I just love. Systems like Ally are out there, which are making something that was an extremely tough process before and still is, right? Because it's still so unclear, but it's going to make it easier than ever to finally make that much more of an automated approach.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to jump back in. I'm going to share my screen again so Sparky can add some additional information. As I mentioned, if I can find my cursor here, we have resources, number of ones that we mentioned today. So we'll make sure that you all get these links. We'll add a couple of things that were mentioned today as well for you before that goes out. And thank you. Clearly, you can tell we're a passionate bunch about this stuff and enjoy talking about it and sharing it with you all. And So we hope that you will join us again in future conversations. And Sparky, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Cherron and Scott and Emily, for your expertise and your perspective today. And thanks to all of you for attending and particularly for your questions. We're glad we can make this a conversation that was useful and helpful to you. And so in addition to those external resources that Cherron shared in the past slide, Helix Education has curated many resources of its own to help you transition from emergency remote learning to quality online education. We talked a lot about these topics today in terms of, staying true to best practices, still a high level of intentionality to build community and deepen affinity, and continue to build knowledge, confidence, and resources, not only in yourself, but in your students as well. And so to that end, we at Helix Education, leaning on our decades of experience in helping online learners to achieve quality outcomes, we've assembled a collection of guides, rubrics, templates, lots of other resources, these webinars included, that are at your disposal to help accelerate your transition to long-term quality online education. So again, rubrics, how-to guides, professional development and training, including these webinars, some foundational templates, as well as documents around benchmarks and KPIs. And as you go through, we're going to put the site up here in a second where you can find all this stuff. We've couched it within these 4 pillars, this idea of institutional online readiness. Today's pillar was focused on the online teaching and learning experience, and then online student experience and engagement, as well as student and parent expectation management. And so when you go on our website to find these resources, you'll find them housed within these different categories. And so you can access any and all of them. If there are some pillars where you feel you or your institution are particularly strong, you can put your focus on to ones where maybe you could see a little bit more improvement or need a little bit more idea generation behind that. We're going to continue to do our webinar series. We've got a couple more scheduled throughout the end of August, and all of our previous webinars are available on our Helix Education YouTube page, as well as on this website with all of these other materials. And so you've been waiting for it for so long. You see it there on the screen. I am also putting it into the chat. So you go to helixeducation.com/new-future, and that is where you will find this bevy of resources available to you, available to download, no additional cost or information needed for these resources. Use them as you see fit. We're going to continue to do webinars and podcasts, like we said. And if there's something in particular that you would like our input on for your particular situation, feel free to send us an email, newfutureinfo@helixeducation.com. Any emails that go to that site go to a handful of us, Cherron included, and we'll connect you with the people who are best positioned to help provide the guidance you need for your particular situation. And again, that URL and email address are in the chat for you to take advantage of there. So once again, Cherron, Scott, Emily, thank you so much for everything that you contributed today. Thanks to all of you for attending. We thank you for the privilege of your time. Stay safe. Have a great rest of your day and week, and we look forward to seeing you again at our webinar next week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.